May 19, 1945. The island of Okinawa. In a makeshift detention camp hastily erected near the southern coastline, 37 Japanese women sat in silence, their eyes cast downward, their bodies rigid with the certainty of what was to come. They had been taught since childhood what to expect from enemy soldiers. The propaganda films had been explicit, the radio broadcasts had been unambiguous, and now as they watched the dark-skinned American soldiers approach their compound, they prepared themselves for the horrors they had been promised would follow capture. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women could not possibly have imagined was that their encounter with the 567th Engineer Battalion would challenge everything they believed about their enemies, about themselves, and about the nature of humanity itself. The women had arrived at the camp over the course of 3 weeks, brought in from caves and villages across the ravaged southern portion of Okinawa. Some had been nurses at field hospitals that had been overrun during the American advance. Others had been civilians caught in the collapse of defensive positions. A few were members of the Himyuri Student Corps, young women barely out of their teens who had been mobilized to support military operations. All of them shared the same expression of hollow-eyed resignation, the same tense posture that suggested they were steeling themselves against inevitable violence. The youngest among them was Emiko Yamamoto, just 17 years old, who had been working as a messenger for a field hospital when the American forces had surrounded her position. She had hidden in a limestone cave for 3 days without food, drinking only the water that dripped from the ceiling, before surrender became the only alternative to slow death from starvation. When the Marines had found her, she had been too weak to run, too exhausted to feel the terror that now gripped her. In the days since her capture, as her physical strength had returned, so too had her fear. She remembered every detail of the propaganda films she had seen, remembered the descriptions of atrocities that awaited women who fell into enemy hands, particularly the hands of the soldiers the Japanese military had described as the most savage of all American forces. Sergeant Robert Williams of the 567th Engineer Battalion had seen that look before. He had seen it in the Philippines, where Filipino civilians had initially fled from his unit, driven by propaganda that painted American forces, particularly black soldiers, as savage brutes. He had seen it in the faces of Korean laborers liberated from Japanese work details, so traumatized by their treatment that they flinched at any sudden movement. But something about the Japanese women's terror struck him differently. These were the daughters, sisters, and wives of the enemy who had fought with such ferocity, yet they sat before him utterly defenseless, vibrating with a fear so profound it seemed to have paralyzed them completely. Williams was 29 years old, a veteran of the European theater before his transfer to the Pacific. He had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where he had learned from an early age what it meant to be judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. His father had been a sharecropper who had taught young Robert to read despite the segregated schools, providing minimal education to black children. His mother had cleaned houses for white families, coming home each evening exhausted, but always insisting that her children maintain their dignity no matter how others treated them. Williams had carried those lessons with him through his entire life, through the humiliation of basic training, where white officers had assumed he was illiterate, through the frustration of being assigned to labor units while less qualified white soldiers received combat positions, through all the daily indignities of serving a country that did not fully recognize his humanity. He had endured segregation in his own country's military, had built roads and bridges while white units received the glory of combat, had faced the casual cruelty of officers who viewed black soldiers as inherently inferior. And now here he was, on a devastated Pacific island, looking into the faces of women who had been told he was a monster, and seeing his own experience reflected back at him. The irony was not lost on Williams. He had been dehumanized by his own countrymen, and now he faced women who had been taught to dehumanize him in turn. The difference was that he had the power in this situation, and power brought with it the responsibility to choose how it would be wielded. The 567th had been assigned to construct supply roads in the southern sector of Okinawa. Backbreaking work made even more difficult by the combination of spring rains that turned the volcanic soil into sucking mud and the continued resistance from Japanese holdouts who refused to accept that the battle was effectively over. The unit had been on the island since April 1st, part of the massive American invasion force that had landed on what the military planners had designated as Love Day. For nearly 2 months, they had worked under sporadic artillery fire and the constant threat of infiltration attacks, building the infrastructure that allowed supplies to flow to the front lines. The battalion had lost men during their time on Okinawa. Private Samuel Henderson had been caught by mortar fire while surveying a road alignment, killed instantly by shrapnel that had torn through his chest. Corporal William Jackson had stepped on a mine that had been overlooked during clearing operations, losing his right leg below the knee. Specialist Eugene Morris had contracted a severe case of dysentery that had nearly killed him before medical treatment finally brought the infection under control. These losses had affected the entire unit, creating an undercurrent of grief and anger that had to be carefully managed to prevent it from boiling over into incidents that could bring disgrace to the battalion. The detention camp assignment had come as a surprise. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, the battalion commander, had been informed that the camp holding Japanese women detainees needed engineering support to improve sanitation and expand capacity. The existing facilities, hastily constructed by marine engineering units during the initial invasion, consisted of little more than barbed wire perimeters and canvas tents that provided minimal protection from the elements. With the rainy season approaching, conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and there was concern about disease outbreaks that could affect both the detainees and the American personnel guarding them. Mitchell had called Williams into his tent to discuss the assignment. The colonel was a 42-year-old career officer from Pennsylvania who had commanded the 567th since its formation 3 years earlier. He was a fair man by the standards of the time, which meant that while he maintained the segregated structure of the military, he also recognized the competence and dedication of the black soldiers under his command. He treated them with a respect that was rare among white officers, and in return, they gave him their loyalty and their best efforts. The colonel had been blunt in his assessment of the situation. The camp needed work, that much was clear. But more than that, it needed to be handled with care. Japanese propaganda had been effective in convincing civilians that capture meant death or worse, and there had already been incidents of mass civilian casualties, as people chose what they believed was a better death over the certainty of capture. If the women in the camp were treated poorly, it would only reinforce those beliefs and make the already difficult task of administering occupied Okinawa even harder. Mitchell needed someone he could trust to handle the assignment with sensitivity and professionalism. He had chosen Williams. Williams had volunteered to lead the detail that would assess the camp's needs and begin improvements. He had brought 20 men with him, carefully selected for their technical skills and, just as importantly, their temperament. He knew that working in close proximity to enemy civilians, particularly women, would require discipline and sensitivity. Any incident could have serious repercussions, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire unit. He had chosen men who understood that, men who could be trusted to maintain their composure and their humanity regardless of circumstances. Among those selected was Private First Class Marcus Johnson, the carpenter from Detroit, whose skills with wood and tools were matched by his gentle demeanor. Johnson was 24 years old, married to his childhood sweetheart Dorothy, and father to a 2-year-old daughter he had never met, having been deployed before her birth. He carried a photograph of his family in his breast pocket, looking at it every evening before sleep, wondering if he would live to see them again. The photograph had sustained him through months of brutal labor and constant danger, reminding him of what he was fighting to return to. There was also Corporal Thomas Jefferson Lee, the mechanical engineer from Chicago, who had designed innovative solutions to the challenges of maintaining equipment in the corrosive salt air and abrasive volcanic dust of Okinawa. Lee was 31, older than most of the enlisted men, a man who had worked in a factory before the conflict, and who understood the principles of industrial production and systematic problem-solving. He approached every challenge methodically, breaking complex problems down into manageable components that could be addressed one at a time. Private James Washington, the medic, was 26 years old, and had been studying to become a doctor before being drafted. He had completed 2 years of pre-medical studies at Howard University, one of the historically black colleges that provided education opportunities unavailable at white institutions. His dream of becoming a physician had been interrupted by the conflict, but he had brought his medical knowledge and his commitment to healing into his military service. He had saved lives on Okinawa, treating wounded soldiers under fire, and he had seen more death and suffering than any medical student should have to witness. When Williams and his men first entered the camp on May 22nd, the reaction from the women was immediate and visceral. Several screamed, others began weeping uncontrollably. A few attempted to flee despite the presence of the wire fence. One young woman, later identified as Keiko Nakamura, a former nurse with the Japanese Imperial Army Medical Corps, actually fainted from apparent terror, collapsing to the muddy ground in a heap. The American guards, white soldiers from a military police unit, watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and indifference. One sergeant, a heavy-set man from Georgia with a thick drawl and a perpetual sneer, made a crude joke about the women's reaction, suggesting that they must know what was coming to them. His comment earned laughs from several of his men, laughter that echoed across the compound with ugly implications. Williams felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, but he maintained his composure. He had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only made things worse. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. He ordered his men to begin surveying the camp's infrastructure, noting deficiencies in the drainage system, the inadequate latrine facilities, and the lack of proper shelter. As they worked, maintaining a respectful distance from the huddled groups of women, Williams noticed that the detainees were gradually calming down, though they continued to watch the black soldiers with wary, fearful eyes. The camp itself was a testament to hasty construction and minimal investment. The perimeter was marked by coils of barbed wire strung between wooden posts, creating an effective barrier, but one that offered no protection from observation or the elements. Inside the perimeter, canvas tents sagged under the weight of accumulated rain, their fabric rotting and torn in places. The ground was churned mud, inches deep in some areas, making movement difficult and unsanitary. The latrine facilities consisted of crude trenches covered with wooden planks, offering no privacy and minimal hygiene. There was a single water spigot that provided untreated water from a nearby stream, water that would need to be boiled before it was safe to drink, but for which no adequate cooking facilities existed. Williams made detailed notes as he walked the perimeter, his practiced eye identifying problems and potential solutions. The camp would need proper drainage to prevent standing water that could breed mosquitoes and spread disease. It would need elevated structures to keep living areas above the mud. It would need improved sanitation facilities that provided both hygiene and privacy. It would need a reliable source of clean water. The list of requirements grew longer as his survey continued, and with each additional item, Williams felt his determination growing. These women deserved better than this, regardless of the uniform they had once supported. The camp interpreter, a Nisei soldier named David Tanaka from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, approached Williams after about an hour. Tanaka was 23 years old, born in California to Japanese immigrant parents who had been sent to internment camps when the conflict began. He had volunteered for military service from behind barbed wire, had fought in Italy with the most decorated unit in American military history, and had then been transferred to the Pacific where his language skills were desperately needed. His situation was deeply complicated. He was fighting against the country of his ancestors, while his own parents remained imprisoned by the country he served. He understood better than most the complexity of loyalty and identity in wartime. Tanaka had been assigned to the camp to facilitate communication between the American authorities and the Japanese detainees, a role that placed him in an awkward position, given that many of the women viewed him as a traitor to his ancestral homeland. They could not understand how someone who looked Japanese, who spoke their language fluently, could fight for the Americans against his own people. Tanaka had learned not to try to explain. He simply did his job, translating words and trying to bridge the vast cultural and linguistic divide that separated the detainees from their captors. Tanaka explained what Williams had already suspected. The women believed that they were going to be assaulted. Japanese military propaganda had been explicit and relentless in its messaging about what happened to women captured by enemy forces, with particular emphasis on the supposed savagery of non-white American troops. The propaganda had drawn on deeply ingrained racial prejudices that existed in Japanese society, portraying black soldiers as subhuman beasts incapable of civilized behavior. For these women, the arrival of the 567th seemed to confirm their worst fears. They believed they were facing their final hours, that the nightmares described in the propaganda films were about to become their reality. Williams listened to Tanaka's explanation, his expression carefully neutral. He had heard similar things before, had become almost inured to the casual racism that seemed to permeate every aspect of wartime propaganda on all sides. But hearing it described so starkly, seeing the genuine terror in the women's faces, made it impossible to simply dismiss or ignore. These women were genuinely convinced that he and his men were monsters. They were certain that horror awaited them. And that certainty was based entirely on lies. Lies that had been told so often and so emphatically that they had become accepted truth. Then Williams asked a question that would set in motion a chain of events that none of them could have anticipated. He asked Tanaka to translate a message to the women. He wanted them to know that he and his men were there to improve their living conditions, nothing more. They would be building proper barracks to replace the leaking tents, improving the sanitation facilities, and ensuring that the camp had adequate drainage to prevent flooding during the heavy rains. No harm would come to them from his soldiers. This was not a trick or a deception. It was simply a statement of intent, a promise that Williams intended to keep. Tanaka translated the message, though his tone suggested he doubted it would have much effect. The women listened in silence, their faces impassive. When Tanaka finished, there was no visible reaction. They simply continued to sit, their eyes averted, their bodies tense. It was as if they had not heard the words, or perhaps had heard them, but could not process what they meant. The disconnect between what they had been taught to expect and what they were being told was too great to bridge in a single moment. Williams nodded to his men, and they returned to their survey work. They moved through the camp methodically, measuring dimensions, testing soil conditions, assessing structural requirements. They worked quietly, professionally, making no unnecessary movements or sounds that might alarm the watching women. Marcus Johnson examined the existing tent structures, noting the poor quality of the canvas and the inadequate support systems. Thomas Jefferson Lee studied the drainage patterns, identifying where water accumulated and how it could be redirected. James Washington inspected the sanitation facilities with a medical professional's eye, cataloging the health hazards that needed to be addressed. As the day wore on, the women began to relax slightly, though their wariness never fully disappeared. They watched the soldiers work, noting the competence and efficiency with which they approached each task. They saw men who clearly knew what they were doing, who moved with purpose and skill. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the absolute terror began to recede, replaced by confusion and uncertainty. This was not what they had been told would happen. The soldiers were not attacking them. They were not even approaching them unnecessarily. They were simply working, measuring, and planning, their focus entirely on the task they had been assigned. That evening, after Williams and his detail had returned to their own bivouac area, the women of the camp gathered in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed. Keiko Nakamura, who had recovered from her earlier fainting spell, found herself at the center of one such discussion. She was 26 years old, a trained nurse who had graduated from a nursing school in Osaka before volunteering for military service. She had worked in field hospitals for 2 years, had seen the worst that modern warfare could inflict on the human body, had held dying men as they called for their mothers in their final moments. She was not naive, not easily fooled, and yet she could not reconcile what she had been taught about the enemy with what she had observed during the day. The discussion was conducted in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might somehow draw unwanted attention. Emiko Yamamoto, the 17-year-old messenger, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Why had the soldiers not attacked them? Why had they simply worked and then left? Was this some kind of psychological torture, making them wait for the inevitable? Or was it possible that what they had been told was not true. The older women counseled caution. One could never trust the enemy. The Americans were clever, everyone knew that. They might be waiting, might be planning something worse than immediate violence. It was important not to let down their guard, not to allow themselves to be lulled into a false sense of security. And yet, even as they spoke these warnings, doubt crept into their voices. They had seen the soldiers' faces. They had watched how the men moved and worked. And nothing about what they had observed matched the descriptions from the propaganda films. Yuki Tanaka, a 24-year-old woman who had helped her father in his temple carpentry business before the conflict, had paid particularly close attention to the soldiers' work methods. She had noticed the way they measured carefully before cutting, the way they discussed problems and solutions, the systematic approach they took to assessing the camp's needs. These were not mindless brutes. These were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. She said as much to the other women, her voice tentative but growing stronger as she articulated what she had observed. Over the following days, a pattern emerged. Each morning, Williams and his detail would arrive at the camp and begin their construction work. They brought materials with them, lumber and tools and supplies that had been requisitioned from military stores. They built wooden platforms to raise the sleeping areas above the muddy ground, constructing frameworks that were both sturdy and efficient. They dug drainage channels following carefully surveyed grades, ensuring that water would flow away from the living areas toward collection points where it could be safely dispersed. They improved the latrine facilities, building proper structures with walls and doors that provided privacy while maintaining hygienic conditions. They erected a communal washing area with privacy screens woven from bamboo, creating a space where the women could attend to personal hygiene with dignity. Throughout all of this, they maintained a professional distance from the women, speaking to them only when necessary and always through Tanaka as interpreter. There was no inappropriate contact, no leering or suggestive comments, no behavior that would validate the fears the women had brought with them into captivity. The soldiers worked hard, often laboring in difficult conditions, and then they left each evening, returning to their own quarters without incident. The women watched this activity with growing confusion. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, the carpenter from Detroit, who was overseeing the construction of the barracks, noticed that some of the younger women had begun studying the Americans' work methods with apparent interest. One woman in particular, whom he would later learn was named Yuki Tanaka, seemed to be paying close attention to how the soldiers were joining the wooden beams, using techniques that minimized the amount of nails required since supplies were limited. Johnson found himself increasingly aware of this attention. He was not uncomfortable with it exactly, but it made him more conscious of his movements and methods. He began to work more deliberately, taking extra care to demonstrate proper technique, even though he knew the watching woman probably did not understand the finer points of what he was doing. It was a strange sensation, being observed so intently by someone who had every reason to fear and hate him, yet who seemed genuinely interested in learning from what he was doing. On the fourth day of construction, something unexpected happened. The skies opened up with one of the fierce rainstorms that characterized Okinawan spring weather. Within minutes, the camp had transformed into a sea of mud. The women, still housed in the old tents, found themselves in increasingly desperate circumstances as water began pooling inside their shelters, soaking through their thin blankets and meager possessions. The tents, already compromised by weeks of use and inadequate maintenance, began to collapse under the weight of accumulated water. The American guards, secure in their own waterproof structures some distance from the main detention area, showed little inclination to help. They watched from their dry posts as the women struggled with failing shelters and rising water, their expressions suggesting they viewed the spectacle as entertainment rather than emergency. Williams made a decision that would prove to be a turning point in the relationship between his men and the women of the camp. He ordered his soldiers to prioritize completing one of the new barracks immediately, even if it meant working through the storm. It was a difficult call. The rain was coming down in sheets. Visibility was poor, and working with wet lumber was challenging and potentially dangerous. But Williams could see that the women needed shelter now, not tomorrow or next week. They needed immediate relief from conditions that were rapidly becoming untenable. For the next 6 hours, The soldiers of the 567th labored in driving rain, their uniforms soaked through within minutes, their hands raw from handling wet lumber and tools. Water ran down their faces, obscuring their vision. The volcanic mud sucked at their boots with each step, making every movement exhausting. The lumber became slippery and heavy, difficult to maneuver and position, and yet they worked with an intensity that surprised even themselves. Driven by something more than just orders or duty, Marcus Johnson worked alongside Thomas Jefferson Lee to position roof beams, their hands numb from cold and wet, but their focus absolute. James Washington helped secure wall panels, his medical training forgotten as he became simply another laborer working against time and weather. Corporal Henry Davis, a welder who had been assigned to work on metal fixtures, found himself driving nails with a hammer, his specialized skills temporarily set aside in favor of whatever contribution he could make to completing the structure. The women watched from their failing tents, unable to fully comprehend what they were witnessing. These soldiers, these men they had been taught were monsters, were working themselves to exhaustion in a rainstorm to build shelter for their prisoners. It made no sense. It contradicted everything they had been told, everything they had believed. And yet, it was happening before their eyes, undeniable and unambiguous. By late afternoon, the first barracks was complete. It was not perfect, not by any means. There were gaps that would need to be filled, details that would have to be addressed when weather permitted, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was dry. Williams approached the women through Tanaka and explained that they should move into the new structure immediately. The women hesitated, uncertainty written across their faces. This had to be a trick, some kind of trap. Why else would the enemy work so hard for their benefit? But as the rain continued to pour down, and their current shelters became increasingly uninhabitable, practical necessity overcame fear. Slowly, cautiously, the women began moving their few possessions into the new barracks. The structure that Williams and his men had built was simple, but solid. It had a raised wooden floor that kept the occupants above the mud, elevated on posts that provided clearance for water to flow beneath without flooding the interior. The floor itself was constructed from rough-cut lumber laid tightly to prevent drafts while allowing for slight air circulation that would help prevent mold and mildew. The roof was properly pitched to shed water effectively, covered with canvas that had been treated with waterproofing compound and secured with a wooden frame that prevented sagging. The walls provided protection from the wind while allowing for ventilation through carefully placed openings, a design feature that balanced the need for shelter with the reality of Okinawa's humid climate. Inside, the barracks had been divided into individual sleeping areas using hanging sheets, creating a semblance of privacy that had been completely lacking in the communal tents. Each sleeping platform had space for personal belongings, a small luxury that acknowledged the women's need for some control over their immediate environment. There were hooks for hanging wet clothing, shelves for storing the few possessions the women had brought with them or had been issued by their captors. It was, by any measure, far superior to what they had been living in. More than that, it was built with care, with attention to small details that spoke of genuine concern for the well-being of its future occupants. That evening, as the storm continued to rage outside, the women of the camp experienced something they had not felt since before the battle for Okinawa began. They felt safe, not completely safe, not free from all worry or fear, but safer than they had felt in months. They felt dry and relatively warm, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to question the narrative they had been taught about their captors. If these soldiers were the monsters from the propaganda films, why would they work so hard to provide comfort? If they intended harm, why go to such lengths to build proper shelter? The questions had no easy answers, and that uncertainty was itself a kind of revelation. Keiko Nakamura, the nurse who had fainted on the first day, found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She lay on the wooden platform that served as her bed, listening to the rain on the roof above, trying to reconcile what she had been told about the enemy with what she had witnessed over the past 4 days. She had been taught that Americans, particularly black Americans, were barbaric, that they viewed Japanese people as subhuman, that capture by such forces meant certain death or worse. Yet here she was, dry and unharmed, lying in a shelter that those same soldiers had built specifically for the comfort of their prisoners, working through a rainstorm when they could have simply returned to their own dry quarters and left the women to struggle. The cognitive dissonance was profound and deeply unsettling. Nakamura had been an ardent believer in the military government's ideology. She had volunteered for nursing service out of genuine patriotic conviction, believing that she was contributing to a righteous cause, a defensive war against Western imperialism. She had worked tirelessly in field hospitals under horrific conditions, had seen countless young men die screaming in agony from wounds that her limited supplies and training could not adequately treat. She had been captured during the evacuation of a hospital cave that had come under American assault, pulled from hiding by Marines who had been surprisingly gentle given the circumstances, and had fully expected to be taken away and never seen again. Instead, she had been brought to this camp, given food that, while basic, was adequate and reasonably nutritious, provided with medical attention for the minor injuries she had sustained during her capture, and now housed in a structure built by men she had been taught to fear above all others. Nothing made sense anymore. Every certainty she had held was being challenged by direct experience that could not be easily dismissed or rationalized away. She found herself wondering what else she had been told that was not true, what other lies had been woven into the fabric of her understanding of the conflict and the world. The next morning brought clear skies and the continuation of construction work. Williams and his men arrived early as they had every day, but this time they brought with them supplies that had been diverted from military stores. There were additional blankets, thick wool ones, that would provide warmth on cool nights. There was soap, both for laundry and personal hygiene, something that had been in desperately short supply. There were basic medical supplies, bandages and antiseptic and pain medication that could be used to treat minor ailments. And there were even some food items beyond the standard rations, tinned goods and dried fruits that would add variety and nutrition to the detainees' diet. Williams had called in favors from other units to obtain these supplies, had traded cigarettes and other valuable commodities, and in some cases had simply requisitioned what he needed, secure in the knowledge that the paperwork would be sorted out eventually, if at all. He knew that his actions were skirting the edges of proper procedure, that he was using his authority in ways that might be questioned by higher command. But he also knew that the women in the camp needed these things, and that bureaucratic protocols should not stand in the way of basic human decency. The women were given the soap and shown the washing facilities that had been completed the previous day. The privacy screens ensured modesty, something that was culturally important to Japanese women, and that the American soldiers had been careful to respect. The water supply, while cold, was clean and abundant, fed from a stream that had been tested and found to be free from contamination. For the first time in weeks, some of the women were able to properly wash themselves and their clothing. It was a simple thing, but its psychological impact was immense. The ability to be clean, to feel fresh, to wear clothes that did not reek of sweat and fear, restored a measure of dignity that had been eroded by the conditions of war and captivity. Yuki Tanaka, the young woman who had been watching the construction techniques, approached Tanaka the interpreter with a hesitant question. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break some fragile spell. Could she help with the building work? She had some experience with carpentry, having helped her father, a temple carpenter, before the conflict began. She wanted to contribute, to somehow repay the kindness that was being shown to them. The request was bold by Japanese cultural standards, particularly for a young unmarried woman, but the extraordinary circumstances of the camp had loosened some traditional constraints. Tanaka translated the request to Williams, who was surprised but pleased. He consulted briefly with Johnson, the lead carpenter, who agreed that an extra pair of hands would be welcome, particularly hands that already had some carpentry experience. And so began an unprecedented collaboration. Yuki Tanaka, enemy civilian and former subject of the Japanese Empire, began working alongside Marcus Johnson, American soldier and representative of the occupying power, to build barracks that would house her fellow detainees. At first, the arrangement was awkward. They communicated primarily through gestures and demonstrations, with the occasional translation from David Tanaka, when he was available and not occupied with other duties. Johnson would show Yuki how to measure lumber using American tools, demonstrating the use of the carpenter's square and explaining through pantomime why certain angles were important for structural integrity. Yuki would nod, absorbing the information with obvious interest, then attempt to replicate what she had been shown. But gradually, they developed a working rhythm that transcended the language barrier. Johnson showed Yuki how to measure and mark lumber using American tools that were somewhat different from the Japanese implements she had learned with, but that served the same fundamental purposes. She demonstrated a traditional Japanese joinery technique that required no nails at all, a method called kumiki that used interlocking wooden joints to create strong connections. Johnson immediately recognized the technique as superior for certain applications, given their limited supplies of nails, and he began incorporating elements of it into his own work. They worked side by side, two people from worlds that had collided with terrible violence, finding common ground in the simple act of building something useful. Johnson found himself genuinely impressed by Yuki's skill and her quick grasp of new techniques. She found herself revising her understanding of American soldiers, seeing in Johnson not a savage enemy, but a skilled craftsman who took pride in his work, and who was willing to learn from her, despite coming from a nation that had defeated hers in battle. Other women began to take notice of this collaboration. Some started helping with smaller tasks, fetching tools from the supplies or holding materials in place while the soldiers worked. The American guards watched this development with bemusement, unsure how to respond to the sight of their prisoners voluntarily assisting with their own imprisonment. Some of them made comments suggesting that the women were being coerced or manipulated, unable to conceive that the collaboration might be genuine. But Williams had made it clear that any woman who wanted to help should be allowed to do so, and the guards, having no particular objection and being generally content to avoid unnecessary work themselves, raised no formal protests. As the second week of construction began, the camp had been transformed. 4 barracks now stood where there had been only muddy tents, solid structures that promised real protection from the elements. The sanitation facilities were modern and hygienic by wartime standards, with proper drainage and privacy that maintained both health and dignity. Drainage channels crisscrossed the camp, ensuring that rainwater flowed away from the living areas toward collection points where it could be safely dispersed or, in some cases, captured for non-drinking uses like washing clothes. The whole operation had taken on the character of a small village being built from scratch, with the 567th providing the expertise and materials, while the women increasingly contributed their own labor and ideas. It was during this period that the first direct conversation between Williams and Nakamura took place. Nakamura had been observing the sergeant for days, studying his interactions with his men and with the women of the camp. She noticed that he treated everyone with the same measured respect, that he never raised his voice in anger, even when things went wrong or when his orders were not immediately understood. She noticed that he seemed to carry himself with a dignity that commanded attention without demanding it, a quiet authority that came not from rank or power, but from some internal source of strength. She had questions that had been building inside her since that first terrifying day, when she had been certain she was about to die. Questions about why these soldiers were acting so differently from what she had been told to expect. Questions about who they were as individuals and what motivated their actions. Questions about her own beliefs and assumptions. The questions had reached a point where they could no longer be contained, where the need to understand had overcome the fear of speaking out. Through Tanaka, she asked Williams why he was helping them. The question was simple in its wording, but complex in its implications. It carried the weight of everything she had believed and everything she had experienced. Why would an American soldier, particularly a black American soldier, who must have faced his own discrimination and hardships, show such consideration to enemy women who had been part of a nation that had attacked his country? What possible motivation could there be for this kindness? Williams was quiet for a long moment before responding. He stood with his hands at his sides, looking at Nakamura with an expression that was difficult to read. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and thoughtful, chosen with care. He told Nakamura that he had learned something important during his time in the service. He had learned that treating people with dignity was not about whether they deserved it or had earned it through their actions. It was about who you were as a person, about the values you held and the choices you made when given power over others. He explained that he had faced hatred and prejudice in his own country, had been judged and found wanting, based on nothing more than the color of his skin. He knew what it felt like to be seen as less than human, to be dismissed and degraded for characteristics over which he had no control. And he had decided somewhere along the way that he would never inflict that experience on others, regardless of circumstances. He would not become the thing he hated. He would not perpetuate cycles of dehumanization and cruelty. He would choose, whenever he had the power to choose, to see others as human beings deserving of basic respect and dignity. He explained that the women in the camp were no longer combatants. They were civilians, detainees who had no power and no agency over their situation. They were vulnerable, and vulnerability demanded protection, not exploitation. It was that simple and that complicated. He and his men were building barracks and improving conditions not because the women deserved mercy based on some calculus of guilt or innocence, but because showing mercy was the right thing to do. Because treating people with dignity was not a gift to be given or withheld based on merit, but a fundamental obligation that came with being human. Tanaka translated William's words, his own voice betraying emotion as he conveyed the sergeant's message. The interpreter found himself moved by what Williams was saying, found himself thinking about his own situation, about the choices he had made and the reasons behind them. Nakamura listened, tears streaming down her face, each word landing with the force of revelation. When Williams had finished speaking, she bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect in Japanese culture, a physical acknowledgement of something that transcended words. Then she asked a follow-up question, one that struck at the heart of everything she had been taught. Her voice was shaking as she spoke, the words coming out in a rush, as if she feared that if she did not ask quickly, she might lose her courage entirely. She asked if he hated the Japanese people for what their military had done to America. Did he hate them for Pearl Harbor, for the Bataan Death March, for all the American lives lost in this terrible conflict? How could he not hate them? How could he show kindness to representatives of a nation that had caused so much death and suffering? William's response was immediate and unflinching. He said that he hated the conflict itself, hated the violence and death and suffering that had resulted from decisions made by leaders on both sides, leaders who sent young men to die for goals that often had more to do with power and pride than with any legitimate defensive necessity. He hated the propaganda and the dehumanization that made it possible for ordinary people to commit extraordinary cruelty against other ordinary people. He hated the waste of human potential, the destruction of lives and communities, the trauma that would echo through generations. But hate the Japanese people? No, he did not hate them. They were people just like him, caught up in forces beyond their control, trying to survive in a world that had gone mad with violence. Most of them had not chosen this conflict any more than he had chosen to be drafted into military service. They had been born into circumstances, had been taught certain beliefs, had been mobilized by their government for purposes they might not have fully understood or agreed with if they had been given the chance to consider alternatives. They were human beings, with families and hopes and fears, and he could not hate them for being human. This conversation marked a turning point in the camp. Word of William's statement spread among the women, discussed in hushed tones during the evening hours when they gathered in their new barracks. The cognitive dissonance that had been building since the 567th's arrival reached a critical point. The women began to truly understand that everything they had been told about their enemy was not just incomplete or exaggerated, but fundamentally false. The propaganda had not been a shading of truth, but a complete inversion of reality, designed to make them fear and hate people who, as it turned out, were capable of remarkable compassion. The realization was devastating in some ways, liberating in others. It meant that the ideology they had believed in, the cause for which so many had died, was built on foundations of deception. The military government had lied to them about the nature of their enemy, which raised questions about what other lies they had been told. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been portrayed as, what did that mean about the justification for the conflict itself? What did it mean about the sacrifices that had been demanded and given? These were difficult questions with no easy answers, questions that would haunt many of the women for the rest of their lives. But the realization was also liberating. It meant that there was hope, that not all humans were capable of the cruelty that had been promised, that mercy and compassion could exist even in the midst of conflict. It meant that the world was more complex than the simple narratives of good and evil that the propaganda had presented. And paradoxically, that complexity was itself a source of hope, because it suggested that healing and reconciliation might be possible even after terrible violence. As June arrived and the construction work neared completion, the relationship between the soldiers of the 567th and the women of the camp had evolved into something remarkable and unprecedented. Language barriers remained significant, but they had developed methods of communication that transcended words. Gestures and facial expressions conveyed meaning. Shared work created bonds of mutual respect. And slowly, carefully, with the help of David Tanaka as interpreter, actual conversations began to take place. Shared meals became common, with the soldiers sharing portions of their rations and the women preparing food using techniques that reminded them of home. They would gather in the evenings, sitting in circles in front of the barracks, and share simple meals that somehow tasted better for being eaten in company. The soldiers would contribute canned goods from their supplies, and the women would use whatever ingredients were available to create dishes that, while far from elaborate, carried the flavors and memories of their culture. Laughter, rare and tentative at first, became more frequent. Someone would make a gesture that was misunderstood in an amusing way, or a language barrier would result in an unintentionally funny exchange, and suddenly people would be laughing together, the sound strange and wonderful after so many weeks of fear and tension. The laughter was not disrespectful of the serious circumstances. Rather, it was an affirmation of life, a recognition that even in darkness, moments of joy were possible and necessary. Private James Washington, the medic with the 567th, began providing basic health care to the women, treating minor ailments and injuries that had been neglected during the chaos of the battle and its aftermath. He worked with Nakamura, whose nursing training made her an invaluable assistant to establish a small clinic within the camp. Together, they treated everything from infected cuts to dysentery, working with limited supplies but unlimited determination. Washington found in Nakamura a kindred spirit, someone who understood the calling of healing, who had seen the worst that humans could do to each other, and had chosen to dedicate herself to repairing that damage as much as possible. They would work side by side, Washington's medical training from American schools complementing Nakamura's practical experience from field hospitals. They shared techniques and knowledge, each learning from the other, creating a synthesis of approaches that was more effective than either alone. Corporal Thomas Jefferson Lee, the mechanical engineer from Chicago, who had been responsible for improving the camp's water supply system, found himself teaching basic engineering principles to a group of fascinated women who had never before considered that such knowledge might be accessible to them. In Japanese society at the time, technical education was largely reserved for men, and women were generally discouraged from pursuing such fields. But here, in this strange circumstance of war and captivity, those barriers began to break down. Lee showed them how to calculate water pressure, demonstrating with simple diagrams drawn in the dirt. He explained how to design filtration systems using locally available materials. He taught them how to solve practical problems through systematic thinking, breaking complex challenges down into manageable components. The women absorbed this information eagerly, their minds hungry for knowledge, after years of being told that their role was simply to support and serve, rather than to understand and create. The transformation was not limited to the detainees. The soldiers of the 567th found themselves changed by the experience as well. Many of them had harbored their own prejudices against the Japanese, understandable given the brutal nature of the Pacific conflict and the propaganda they had been exposed to from their own side. They had lost friends and comrades to Japanese forces, had seen the aftermath of battles where surrender had not been an option for either side, where wounded soldiers had been left to die in agony. But working daily with these women, seeing their humanity, Hearing their stories through Tanaka's translations had made it impossible to maintain those simplistic hatreds. Marcus Johnson found himself thinking about his wife Dorothy and his daughter back in Detroit, wondering what kind of world he wanted them to live in. He realized that the hatred and dehumanization that had made this conflict possible were the same forces that sustained segregation and discrimination in his own country, and if he wanted a better world for his family, he needed to be part of creating that world, needed to choose compassion over hatred whenever he had the opportunity to make that choice. Sergeant Williams received official commendation for the work his detail had accomplished at the camp. The structures they had built were photographed and used as models for other detention facilities being established throughout the Pacific Theater. The improved sanitation and living conditions had prevented the disease outbreaks that had plagued other camps, saving lives and reducing the burden on military medical resources. From a purely military efficiency standpoint, the project had been a remarkable success, and Williams's superiors were pleased. But for Williams and his men, the real measure of success was something that could not be captured in official reports or photographs. It was visible in the faces of women who had arrived at the camp certain they were going to die and who now had hope for a future beyond captivity. It was present in the relationships that had formed across vast cultural and linguistic divides, relationships that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. It was embodied in the simple fact that human decency had prevailed over hatred and fear, that compassion had proven stronger than propaganda. On June 15, 1945, the 567th Engineer Battalion was reassigned to a new construction project on the northern part of Okinawa. Their work at the detention camp was complete. The structures were finished, the systems were functioning, and the camp was ready to house detainees through whatever came next in the occupation of the island. The departure was emotional in ways that surprised everyone involved, both the soldiers who were leaving and the women who were staying behind. The women lined up to see the soldiers off, many of them weeping openly, tears streaming down their faces without shame or attempt at concealment. This was not the stoic, controlled emotion that Japanese cultural norms typically demanded in public. This was raw, genuine grief at parting from people who had become important to them. Gifts were exchanged, small tokens that would be treasured for years to come, physical reminders of an extraordinary encounter. Yuki Tanaka gave Marcus Johnson a small wooden crane she had carved during the evening hours, working by lamplight with a borrowed knife. The crane was a symbol of hope and longevity in Japanese culture, and she had put hours of careful work into making it perfect, getting the proportions exactly right, smoothing the wood until it was silky under the fingers. Johnson accepted it with visible emotion, understanding even without translation that this was more than just a gift. It was an expression of gratitude and connection that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Nakamura presented Williams with a carefully written letter in English, the product of many evenings of work with David Tanaka, helping her find the right words. The letter expressed gratitude that transcended the limitations of her vocabulary, thanking Williams not just for the buildings and the improved conditions, but for treating her and the other women as human beings deserving of dignity. She wrote about how the experience had changed her understanding of the world, had given her hope that reconciliation was possible even after terrible violence. Williams accepted the letter, his own eyes damp, and promised to keep it always. As the trucks carrying the 567th rolled out of the camp, the soldiers looked back at the structures they had built and the women they were leaving behind. It was a strange feeling, this sense of accomplishment mixed with sadness and uncertainty. They were moving on to the next task, the next project, in a conflict that seemed like it might never end, despite growing signs that Japanese resistance was collapsing. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had made a difference in a small corner of a devastated island, that they had chosen compassion when cruelty would have been easier, that they had affirmed human dignity when dehumanization was the norm. The women of the camp watched the trucks disappear into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller until they were just clouds of dust on the horizon, then slowly returned to their barracks. The building stood solid and secure, testament to the skill and care of their builders, structures that would shelter them through whatever came next. But more than physical structures, what remained was something intangible, but infinitely more valuable. It was the memory of being treated with dignity when they had expected only degradation. It was the experience of being seen as human beings rather than as enemy objects. It was the understanding that the world was more complex and more hopeful than they had been led to believe. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.